Hi folks, welcome back. This is gonna be a bit of an emo rambling video. It started with this tweet, and I want to talk a little bit about my own personal journey as a programmer coming to terms with how AI is changing programming. So I've been using a lot of AI in my programming, my shell scripting, etc. And I've been doing that ever since LLMs came out. And they have only gotten better and better over time. And today's programming agents, especially the CLI agents like Claude Code, are just astonishingly good. Now, the feeling I personally have is that as soon as the first whiffs of automation hit a type of work, it rapidly becomes uninteresting as a place to put time and effort into to achieve some sort of mastery. And I think a lot of people feel this way, at least a lot of people who try to achieve mastery in a domain feel this way. My personal example is not just with programming, but just also, shell scripting. Back in the day when I first started using Linux and Unix, I spent a lot of time learning the command line, shell scripting, pipes, all the little Unix utilities. And I could do a lot of complex tasks by writing these long, complex pipelined command lines. And I spent a ton of time reading man pages and getting familiar with all the esoteric command line options and flags and whatnot. And at the time, it really did make me feel like a wizard because I could wield these tools to great effect. And fast forward to the current day, if you see Claude Code just crank through some complex multi-step task by writing shell scripts, executing things on the command line, writing Python, and even if it stumbles, it just looks at what broke. It uses its world knowledge, it fixes it, it keeps trying and trying again until it works. It looks at whether the output makes sense. So these are all things that I used to do as a human when I was writing these long, complex pipelines. And Claude Code just does it like a robot. And watching it achieve and surpass my level of mastery at something I had spent so much time and effort into, it just completely takes away any will I have to master that skill. So if I were beginning to learn these things today, I wouldn't spend so much time into mastering shell scripting. I would maybe learn enough to read and understand shell scripts to, if I were given a shell script, be able to figure out what's happening in it. But yeah, I don't think I would be putting in the long hours and years of diving deep into all this esoterica to master it. Now, the thing is, I would still, personally speaking at least, I would still have that desire and enthusiasm to go deep and master a topic. And that is a function of the person. It's not a function of the systems and tools around you. But I would just put all that desire and enthusiasm somewhere else, much likely at a much higher place on the app stack. This whole notion of how programmers relate to their tools, how they tie up their skills and their tools with their identity has been a topic I've been fascinated with for a very long time. If you look at my blog, I've been writing about these topics for more than a decade. This post I wrote the day after GPT-4 was released. And there was this one point in the now famous GPT-4 demo that Greg Brockman was doing that really put me in a funk because, like many programmers, I did have a lot of my self-worth and my identity tied up in the craft of programming. And I just want to show you that live stream to refresh everyone's memory. This was the napkin to website demo that Greg Brockman was doing. I just want to revisit that demo to refresh everyone's memory.
So I have here a nice hand-drawn mock-up of a joke website. Definitely worthy of being put up on my refrigerator. So I'm just going to take out my phone.
So he takes the photo and gives it to a Discord chat that hooks up to GPT-4.
So the thing that's amazing in my mind is that what's going on here is we're talking to a neural network. And this comes next across an unimaginably large amount of content. And from there, it learns all of these skills that you can apply in all of these very flexible ways to output the HTML from that picture. And here we go. Actual working Java.
Yeah, so he took a napkin picture of a website mockup and got GPT-4 to generate code for it. And that was really the point at which the point really came home for me that LLMs are just gonna completely change how programming will be done. And I wasn't the only one. It's not like I had some blinding insight. There were tons of other people. Matt Welsh, around the same time, was giving this talk at various venues about how Copilot and future things along those lines would completely change programming. But I was slightly surprised at how much resistance and pushback and just denial there was in the developer community to using AI for programming. And that's what made me write this blog post. I was going back in time to look at the history of how programmers reacted to the earliest compilers. I'll leave a link to this blog post below, but long story short, in the 50s and 60s, when folks at IBM and other places were developing and putting out the very first compilers for languages like Fortran, they were showing these massive productivity boosts because before compilers, people were writing programs in assembly language by hand. And that was, of course, incredibly low level. It was painstaking. It was error prone. And even though today, to a modern developer, it seems obvious that compilers are a big step up. At the time, these early pioneers who were trying to get programmers to adopt compilers were actually getting a lot of resistance. People had all kinds of arguments to resist using compilers. One of the most common ones was that compilers would not be as efficient as handwritten assembly. And to be fair, in some cases that was true, but of course it wasn't true for very long. There was also an argument about having control over what the machine is doing. But as we know today, none of these arguments actually stood because, of course, compilers were a great thing. Of course, we all began to write code in high level languages. And it didn't decimate the field of programming. In fact, it led to a boom in programming. But even today, when I relate this history, a lot of people are surprised by this. Most of the people that I have told this history to are surprised by the fact that the programmers of the time were resistant to the earliest compilers. Now, of course, there is a fairly large contingent of geeks and nerds and programmers that are really, really into AI and LLMs, and they are building cool things and cool tools and experiments with LLMs. This is Venkatesh Rao, whom some of you might know from the Ribbon Farm blog back in the day. And I think he really hits the nail on the head in this piece, calling AI a ludic technology. And what he means by ludic, that's basically a fancy term for something that's very playful. So AI and LLMs are really playful technologies, and I think that is a big part of their appeal. I'll leave a link to this piece below. Rao, by the way, has been doing a lot of vibe writing on his Substack, and at the end of some of his vibe written pieces, he actually lays out how he prompted the LLM to flesh out his ideas or get feedback on his ideas and actually write the pieces that he wrote. But if you've been following his writing for a while, even those vibe written pieces read very much like classic Venkatesh Rao pieces. They don't read like AI slop. They still have his voice. And that finally brings me to this notion of above the API versus below the API. This is another classic Venkatesh Rao piece, The Premium Mediocre Life of Maya Millennial. Great piece on its own, but I want to focus in on this notion where he talks about you're either above the API or below the API, which essentially means that you are either given instructions by some automated system, i.e., you're below the API, or you are above the API, so to speak, and you are the one giving instructions rather than receiving them. And this notion was originally coined by Peter Reinhardt in this other blog post. It's from 2015, way before LLMs, but in this blog post, he uses the example of Uber, where Uber is essentially an API that will ship a driver with a car to you and take you where you want to go. And at the time, this was written in the context of SaaS and the internet and APIs. But if you think about it, LLMs and AI are the ultimate API because they understand natural language. They don't even need to be in code anymore. You just need to give them the right tools. And these tools are usually APIs, so they're the next level of abstraction above APIs. But they can essentially automate natural language. Anyway, so that was a long-winded series of loosely related ideas that were kicked off by this little tweet. Hopefully some of it made sense. I will leave links to all these things below in the description. And I'll just end by saying that when I wrote this piece, I was not feeling good about my future as a programmer. This piece, which I wrote right after GPT-4 came out. Uh, but now that I've had some time to get familiar with the models, use them in programming, I feel much better now. And I think net net, it's going to be a huge boon for programmers. So that's my personal bias. That's why I'm such an optimist for the impact of AI on programming and coding and all that stuff. All right. Thanks.